Hi, my name is Beth and I'm a sewing pattern designer and blogger at Sew DIY. In today's video, I'm going to talk about how to sew knit fabric without using a serger. I know when I first started sewing, I only used woven fabrics, and for a long time, I was really nervous and scared of sewing with knit fabric because I just didn't know how to do it. And I definitely didn't have a serger. I just had a really basic sewing machine, and I was really stumped about what to do. So it took me a long time. I did a lot of research and a lot of practice, and now knit fabrics are one of my favorite things to sew with. So in today's video, I'm going to show you the very few supplies that you will need to sew with knit fabrics, and then I will demonstrate some stitches that should be available on your conventional sewing machine that you should use with knit fabrics. So today I'm going to be using my Janome Memory Craft to demonstrate a few stitches, but don't worry, you don't need something this fancy. There are a lot of really affordable beginner machines out there that have all of these stitches and features. The one that I recommend is the Brothers CS6000i, and I will put a link to that down in the show notes. I used that machine for about 10 years and I was able to sew all the knits really easily. It does everything that this machine can do as far as the stitches and the walking foot. So it's always my recommendation to get that machine if you're just starting out and you don't want to invest a lot of money. All right, let's get started. So the first thing that you'll want to do when you're sewing knit fabric is to choose the appropriate needle. And most of the time you're going to want a ballpoint needle. And these will come in a variety of sizes. So depending on whether you're using a really thin t-shirt knit or like a really thick sweatshirt, you'll choose a different weight or thickness of the needle. And these ballpoint needles are rounded at the end, and that's going to prevent making holes in your fabric. So there are a couple of other kinds of these needles, and there are also stretch needles or jersey needles. And I think the jersey are pretty similar to the ballpoint, but sometimes a stretch needle is going to work better. And usually I've found that a stretch needle is good when I'm sewing swimwear fabric or sewing underwear and like a lot of elastic. So sometimes I will find that with swimwear fabric or elastic, and if I use a ballpoint needle, I'll get skip stitches, but with the stretch, that doesn't happen as much. So you'll just need to test out your fabric and figure out what needle is going to work best. So I always recommend starting with a scrap of fabric and testing out your needle and your stitches. So next, let's talk about the presser foot. This is just a regular presser foot, and this is what most machines will come with. I usually like to use a walking foot when I'm sewing knit fabric. And this is also called a dual feed foot, and it will actually push the fabric from the top the same as the feed dogs do from the bottom. So it prevents the fabric from stretching out as you sew. If you don't have a walking foot, you can put a piece of tissue paper or tracing paper underneath your fabric. So you just put it down, and you want to make sure that it's going to be underneath where you're stitching. I also like to put some tissue paper hanging off the back because that will give something for the feed dogs to grab onto. And that's actually a technique you can use anytime your machine is having problems feeding your fabric through. Just put a little bit of tissue paper right here where you're going to start stitching, and it'll help it move along and get started. So if you're sewing knits and you don't have that walking foot, you might find that it's helpful to have the tissue paper, and you just stitch right on top of the tissue paper, and then when you're done, you gently tear the paper away. And this will just prevent it from stretching as you sew. One other thing, certain kinds of machines will have a dual feed feature where there's a little foot or little lever that comes down at the back of your presser foot, and it will feed your fabric through, so you don't have to install anything different. It's just already there. I believe it's usually FAF machines that have that, so that's a really cool feature. And that is really handy when you're sewing something like underwear, bras, or panties that have a really tiny seam allowance and they're really tiny pieces of fabric. Because when you have a big walking foot like this, it's kind of hard to handle those little tiny pieces of fabric. So that's a benefit to those machines that have kind of the automatic drop down dual feed feature. Okay, next we're going to start talking about stitches, and I thought it would be interesting just to test out if we were to sew this fabric with a regular straight stitch and the regular machine. Let's just see what happens. Okay, so you can already see that it's stretching out this fabric. Okay, so here, this is just a straight stitch, and you can see that as it sewed it, it stretched the fabric a little bit, and that's not good. You don't want your fabric to stretch out. The other thing about a regular straight stitch is that it's not going to be as sturdy as some other stitches because that stitch is not made to stretch. So if you pull, it's just gonna break. So if you're wearing like a tight t-shirt or bodysuit and you use a regular straight stitch, when you put that on your body and the fabric stretches as you put it on or as you're wearing it, your stitches are going to break or pop. So it really doesn't take that much. I didn't have to pull very hard and those stitches are broken. So we don't want that. We want to use a stitch that has stretch. And there are a few different stitches that do have stretch. So the most accessible stitch is going to be a zigzag stitch. And for this example, let's do our tissue paper and regular presser foot. When I first started sewing knits, this is how I would do it because I didn't have a walking foot. So I'm going to change my machine settings. So I'm going to demonstrate a seaming stitch, and this would be just for any, regular seam. And I'm doing it 1.5 wide and 2.2 long. And again, you can experiment and find the length and width that's going to work best for your fabric. So let's just go ahead and give this a try. It's kind of wrinkly. I'm going to adjust. Okay, so I think maybe it stretched a little bit while we were sewing, and some of this can be fixed with an iron. So I'm just going to gently tear this paper away. And this is a pretty thin tracing paper. So I like to just kind of hold the stitches in place and then tear the paper. All right, that's fine. So you'll be able to just use this stitch and, press your seam to the side or press it open. And you can see when you pull it, it's not going to break. So that's your really important test, that these stitches are going to stretch while you're wearing your garment. Now, for the sake of testing, let's put on our walking foot. So I wanted to show you, these are 2 walking feet for different machines. This is for my brother's CS6000i, and it comes with a walking foot. That's one of the features I really liked about it. And then this is my Janome, and this is a Memory Craft. So it has a walking foot, and it's pretty similar. Both of them have kind of this hook that goes onto this shaft right here. And then this one has a little arm that'll go on here that'll help lift up your foot. This one, my Janome, you have to make sure to get kind of these hooks in place, and that'll make sure that it can do its little walking motion. So let's get all of these in here. You have to make sure you get both hooks in place. So there's one hook right here by the screw and then another hook at the back. And you should just consult your sewing machine's manual to find how to install your walking foot. So let's do another sample. Okay, I'm going to do the zigzag stitch again and not use any tissue paper. So you can see that that looks really nice, and it really didn't stretch as much as our other one. And again, you can pull it and it's not going to break. So the zigzag stitch is a really useful stitch. Most machines come with it. For your seaming, I do 1.5 wide and 2.2 long. And then for top stitching, I usually do 2.5 wide and 2.5 long. So again, you can just experiment with those and find what works best for you. But those are not the only stitch options that you have. Most machines, including that really affordable brother that I mentioned, will have a lot of options for you. So my next favorite stitch is the lightning stitch. And that's kind of like a zigzag, except it's a lot tighter, and it has one long stitch and one short one. So it'll create a really secure seam. And this is a seam that I really like to use, or a stitch I really like to use when sewing something like leggings that you want to have super secure, because they're going to have a lot of pressure on them. So the only drawbacks of the lightning stitch is that it's a little slow to stitch. It's slower than the zigzag, and it's really tight. So if you need to remove those stitches and unpick them, it's going to take a long time. So I often will baste before I use the lightning stitch if I'm not sure about my sizing, and I will often increase the length of the lightning stitch from the default. So the default on this machine for a lightning stitch is 1.0 wide by 2.5 long. And I will often increase it to like a 3.0 long, just because it's so secure that I feel confident it's going to be okay. All right, so let's test this one out. First, I want to pause for a side note. My Janome manual says that you should not use the zigzag stitch or the lightning stitch or some of these other stitches that I really like to use for knits when you're using the walking foot. And I think that's because those stitches go backwards a little bit, and the walking foot's really made to go forwards. But I really find it useful to use the walking foot along with those stitches, so I've been doing it. If you're not comfortable with that, don't do it. But just wanted to mention that my manual says don't use those stitches with the walking foot, and I am ignoring it. Let's sew a lightning stitch. So here's another note. Sometimes with a walking foot, your fabric can kind of bunch up right between the needle and this back part of the foot. And that's an instance where it's helpful to have your tissue paper underneath, because that'll help it feed all the way through and not get caught up. Okay, so there is our lightning stitch. You can see it's a lot tighter and tinier. It's more narrow than our zigzag stitch. And we have to do our stretch test. So that's fine. We don't have any breaking stitches. And when you open it, it's pretty secure. And if you use a matching thread, you won't be able to see the thread at all. So this is a really good secure stitch. And if you do it at the default length, it's probably even a little more secure than it looks right here. So another really useful stitch for sewing knits is a triple zigzag. So the triple zigzag will stitch 3 in one direction and then 3 in the other direction. And this one you'll see in ready-to-wear clothing. I've seen it on bras that I've bought in a store. And so it can make a really nice top stitch. So you can see it's a really pretty stitch. It has stretch. It's a really great option. You can vary the width and length just like other stitches. And again, I recommend just testing that, seeing what works for you. You can look at some of your ready-to-wear clothing, see if it has a certain width or length that looks really nice, and copy that. So another stitch that has stretch is a triple stretch stitch, or triple straight stitch, I call it sometimes. And this is a straight stitch that goes forward, backward, forward, forward, backward, forward. So it stitches in the same place 3 times. Let's take a look. Again, it takes a little bit longer to sew than a zigzag because you're going back and forth so much. And you can see that it is really stretchy, so this could be a good option for top stitching if you like. Yeah, also this one does look like it's a little bit stretched out, but this is our greatest amount of stretch side, so you'll just have to experiment and find what your fabric really behaves the best with. Your machine may also have a variety of overcast or overlock stitches, and these will simulate the stitches that you can make with a serger. So with my machine, they recommend that you use this foot to sew those stitches. So let's try out the overlock stitch. So my manual says that this stitch is for seaming and doing the overcast. So just like what a serger would do. Put my M foot on there, and then what you do is you line up the edge of your fabric with this little metal bar in the foot. And sometimes I like to use these stitches for overcasting woven fabric as well. Okay. So I think we might be getting a little bit of stretching. It could help to have our tissue paper underneath for this fabric. And this is why you always test on scrap. Okay, so there's a little overcast. Stitches are not breaking. And it's pretty secure. I think it's pretty comfortable. The one thing about this stitch is, you'll have to press your seams to the side. Whereas when you have, for example, our lightning stitch, you can press these seams open. So this is really helpful. If you're using a bulky fabric or something, you may not want to press seams to the side, and you may want to press them open. Now let's try an overlock stitch. This is meant to finish the edge of the fabric. And remember, most of our knits are not going to fray at the edge of the fabric, so you don't really have to worry about finishing it, but you might want just to give it a little extra, kitty. Go on. But you might want to if your fabric frays a little bit, or you just like that look. So this is probably not the best stitch to use with the tissue paper because it kind of stitches way out, but we'll see how it works. Okay, so you could see it was stitching here and then it stitched way off to the right and stitched some stitches along the edge. So it does create this nice seam finish. We can just tear away that paper. It's a nice seam finish that looks similar to an overlocker or serger. So you can do this to the edge of your fabric, then seam it together with your stitch of choice. This would also be a good option for the hems of your fabric. So you can do this along the edge, fold it, press, and then top stitch in place. So that would give you a really nice clean look. So I have a couple more overcast stitches. Let's just try them out and see how they look. So like I said, sometimes I'll use these on woven fabric and I will just test all the different stitches and see which ones really look best with my fabric and which ones the fabric behaves well with, because these stitches all have a slightly different pattern. So this is another option to this one for just finishing that edge. This machine has one more stitch. This one, that last one was the knit stitch. This is the double over edge stitch. So you can see this is our latest one. This is the double over edge. This is called a knit stitch, and this is called the overlock stitch. So you can just try all these different stitches, see which one you like the look of best, the one that your fabric reacts to the best. And all of these would be really great for the hemmed edge of a fabric. You can just fold it under and then top stitch, and you can top stitch using a zigzag, a twin needle, or a triple zigzag stitch. And I have a video with tips about how to use a twin needle that I will put a link to here and in the show notes. Well, I hope that you found that video helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and if you haven't already, I would be so honored if you hit the little subscribe button down below and then hit the bell to be notified every time I release a new video. Happy sewing!